as an art. Part 2. Reasons to hate use the internet. As an artist. When I left you, I was getting into subjectivity, what it means to me as an artist and how the internet impacts my understanding of it. In my previous videos, I was concerned with generating visual justification of myself as an artist, through the act of painting, the cliché universal symbol of being an artist, whilst also including aspects of my actual practice in the video, reflection, contextual research, idea and tool testing. Our work of pure existence under the divine gaze. Artistic practice is often understood as being individual and personal. After Nietzsche famously announced, "God is dead," he continued, "We have lost the spectator." The emergence of the internet means the return of the universal spectator. So it seems that we are back in paradise, have found utopia, and, like saints, do the immaterial work of pure existence under the divine gaze. Artistic practice is often understood as being individual and personal. But what does the individual or personal mean? The individual is often understood as being different from others. For example, in a totalitarian society, all are alike. In a democratic, pluralistic society, all are different, and respected as being different. However, here the point is not so much one's difference from others but one's difference from oneself, the refusal to be identified according to the general criteria of identification. Indeed, the parameters that define our socially codified, nominal identity are completely foreign to us. We did not choose our names, we were not consciously present at the date and place of our birth, we did not choose the name of the city or street where we live, we did not choose our parents, our nationality, and so forth. All these external parameters of our existence have no meaning for us, they do not correlate to any subjective evidence. They indicate how others see us, but they are completely irrelevant to our inner, subjective lives. Maybe not completely, but the point is there, and particularly relevant right now. White people, aka me, denying our whiteness by treating it as if it is default normal and in the same action alienating all those who are outside our definition of white, without perhaps recognizing it initially but continuing on all the same, even after we come to see the effects. Modern artists revolted against the identities imposed on them by others, by society, state, school, parents. They wanted the right of sovereign self-identification. Modern art was the search for the true self. Here the question is not whether the true self is real or merely a metaphysical fiction. The question of identity is not a question of truth but a question of power. Who has the power over my own identity, I myself or society? And more generally, who has control over the social taxonomy, the social mechanisms of identification, I myself or state institutions? This means that the struggle against my own public persona and nominal identity in the name of my sovereign persona, my sovereign identity, also has a public, political dimension, since it is directed against the dominating mechanisms of identification, the dominating social taxonomy, with all its divisions and hierarchies. That is why modern artists always said, "Do not look at me. Look at what I am doing. That is my true self," or maybe no self at all, maybe the absence of the self. Later, artists mostly gave up the search for the hidden, true self. Rather, they began to use their nominal identities as ready-mades, and to organize a complicated play with them. But this strategy still presupposes disidentification from nominal, socially codified identities, in order to artistically reappropriate, transform, and manipulate them. Modernity was the time of desire for utopia. The utopian expectation means nothing less than that one's project of discovering or constructing the true self becomes successful and socially recognized. In other words, the individual project of seeking the true self acquires a political dimension. The artistic project becomes a revolutionary project that aims at the total transformation of society and the obliteration of existing taxonomies. Here the true self becomes resocialized by creating the true society. The museum system is ambivalent towards this utopian desire. On the one hand, the museum offers the artist a chance to transcend his or her own time, with all its taxonomies and nominal identities. The museum promises to carry the artist's work into the future. It is a utopian promise. However, the museum betrays this promise at the same moment that it fulfills it. The artist's work is carried into the future, but the nominal identity of the artist becomes reimposed on his or her work. In the museum catalogue, we read the same name, date and place of birth, nationality, and so forth. That is why modern art wanted to destroy the museum. However, the Internet betrays the search for the true self in an even more radical way. The Internet inscribes this search from its beginning, and not only at its end, back into nominal, socially codified identity. In turn, revolutionary projects become historicized. We can see it today, as former communist mankind becomes renationalized and reinscribed in Russian, Chinese, and other national histories. In the so-called postmodern period, the search for the true self and, accordingly, the true society in which this true self could be revealed, was proclaimed to be obsolete. We therefore tend to speak about postmodernity as a post-utopian time. But this is not quite true. Postmodernity did not give up the struggle against the subject's nominal identity. In fact, it even radicalized this struggle. Postmodernity had its own utopia, a utopia of the subject's self-dissolution and infinite, anonymous flows of energy, desire, or the play of signifiers. Instead of abolishing the nominal, social self by discovering the true self through art production, postmodern art theory invested its hopes for complete loss of identity through the process of reproduction, a different strategy pursuing the same goal. The postmodern utopian euphoria that the notion of reproduction provoked at the time can be illustrated by the following passage from the book On the Museum's Ruins by Douglas Crimp. In this well-known book, Crimp claimed, with reference to Walter Benjamin, that through reproductive technology, postmodernist art dispenses with the aura. The fiction of the creating subject gives way to the frank confiscation, quotation, acceptation, accumulation, and repetition of already existing images. Notions of originality, authenticity, and presence, essential to the order discourse of the museum, are undermined. The flow of reproductions overflows the museum, and individual identity drowns in this flow. The Internet became for some time the place where these postmodern utopian dreams were projected, dreams about the dissolution of all identities and the infinite play of signifiers. The globalized rhizome took the place of communist mankind. However, the Internet has become not a place for the realization of postmodern utopias, but their graveyard, as the museum became a graveyard for modern utopias. Indeed, the most important aspect of the Internet is that it fundamentally changes the relationship between original and copy, as described by Benjamin, and thus makes the anonymous process of reproduction calculable and personalized. On the Internet, every free-floating signifier has an address. The deterritorializing data flows become reterritorialized. Walter Benjamin famously distinguished between the original, which is defined through its here and now, and the copy, which is sightless, topologically indeterminable, lacking a here and now. Contemporary digital reproduction is by no means sightless. Its circulation is not topologically undetermined, and it does not present itself in the form of a multiplicity as Benjamin described it. Every data file's address on the Internet accords it a place. The same data file with a different address is a different data file. Here the aura of originality is not lost, but instead substituted by a different aura. On the Internet, the circulation of digital data produces not copies, but new originals. And this circulation is perfectly traceable. Individual pieces of data are never deterritorialized. Moreover, every Internet image or text has not only its specific unique place, but also its unique time of appearance. The Internet registers every moment when a certain piece of data is clicked, liked, unliked, transferred, or transformed. Accordingly, a digital image cannot be merely copied as an analog, mechanically reproducible image can, but always only newly staged or performed. And every performance of a data file is dated and archived. During the epoch of mechanical reproduction, we heard a lot about the demise of subjectivity. We heard from Heidegger that Die Sprache spricht, the language speaks, and not so much that an individual uses the language. We heard from Marshall McLuhan that the medium is the message. Later, Derridian deconstruction and delusion machines of desire taught us to get rid of our last illusions concerning the possibility of identifying and stabilizing subjectivity. However, now our digital souls have become traceable and visible again. Our experience of contemporaneity is defined not so much by the presence of things to us as spectators, but rather by our presence to the gaze of the hidden and unknown spectator. What does this look like? How is IT signified? What is the Internet's semiotic representation? However, we do not know this spectator. We have no access to its image, if this spectator has an image at all. In other words, the hidden universal spectator of the Internet can be thought only as a subject of universal conspiracy. The reaction to this universal conspiracy necessarily takes the form of a counter-conspiracy. One will protect one's soul from the evil eye. Contemporary subjectivity can no longer rely on its dissolution in the flow of signifiers because this flow has become controllable and traceable. Thus, a new utopian dream emerges, a truly contemporary dream. It is the dream of an unbreakable code word that can forever protect our subjectivity. We want to define ourselves as a secret that would be even more secretive than the ontological secret, the secret that even God cannot discover. The paradigmatic example of such a dream can be found in WikiLeaks. The goal of WikiLeaks is often seen as the free flow of data, as the establishment of free access to state secrets. But at the same time, the practice of WikiLeaks demonstrates that universal access can be provided only in the form of universal conspiracy. In an interview, Julian Assange says, "So if you and I agree on a particular encryption code, and it is mathematically strong, then the forces of every superpower brought to bear on that code still cannot crack it. So a state can desire to do something to an individual, yet it is simply not possible for the state to do it, and in this sense, mathematics and individuals are stronger than superpowers. Transparency is based here on radical non-transparency. The universal openness is based on the most perfect closure. The subject becomes concealed, invisible, takes time out to become operative. The invisibility of contemporary subjectivity is guaranteed insofar as its encryption code cannot be hacked, insofar as the subject remains anonymous, non-identifiable. It is password-protected invisibility alone that guarantees the subject's control over its digital operations and manifestations. I get what he is saying here about encryption being the only thing that has the capacity to conceal someone online. However, there is an uncertain problem with online concealment in the infrastructure that it's hosted on provides safe harbor only in good faith or when legally obliged to. I'm not asserting that there must always be a backdoor. However, in situations where it is of economic or strategic advantage, it's difficult to imagine a privately owned corporation protecting or maintaining their user agreement without additional motivation. Here I am of course discussing the Internet as we know it now. But I expect that the coming cyber wars will change the Internet radically. These cyber wars have already been announced, and they will destroy or at least seriously damage the Internet as a dominant marketplace and means of communication. The contemporary world looks very much like the 19th century world. That world was defined by the politics of open markets, growing capitalism, celebrity culture, the return of religion, terrorism, and counterterrorism. World War I destroyed this world and made the politics of open markets impossible. In the end, the geopolitical and military interests of individual nation-states showed themselves to be much more powerful than economic interests. A long period of wars and revolutions followed. Let us see what is waiting for us in the near future. I would like to close with a more general consideration of the relationship between utopia and the archive. As I have tried to show, the utopian impulse is always related to the desire of the subject to break out of its own historically defined identity, to leave its place in the historical taxonomy. In a certain sense, the archive gives to the subject the hope of surviving one's own contemporaneity and revealing one's true self in the future, because the archive promises to sustain and make accessible this subject's texts or artworks after his or her death. This utopian, or, at least, heterotopian promise is crucial to the subject's ability to develop a distance from an uncritical attitude towards its own time and its own immediate audience. Archives are often interpreted as a means to conserve the past, to present the past in the present. But at the same time, archives are machines for transporting the present into the future. Sorry about that, my internet cut out and so my stream dropped. I would like to close with a more general consideration of the relationship between utopia and the archive. As I have tried to show, the utopian impulse is always related to the desire of the subject to break out of its own historically defined identity, to leave its place in the historical taxonomy. In a certain sense, the archive gives to the subject the hope of surviving one's own contemporaneity and revealing one's true self in the future, because the archive promises to sustain and make accessible this subject's texts or artworks after his or her death. This utopian, or, at least, heterotopian promise is crucial to the subject's ability to develop a distance from an uncritical attitude towards its own time and its own immediate audience. Archives are often interpreted as a means to conserve the past, to present the past in the present. But at the same time, archives are machines for transporting the present into the future. Artists always do their work not only for their own time but also for art archives, for the future in which the artist's work remains present. This produces a difference between politics and art. Artists and politicians share the common here and now of public space, and they both want to shape the future. That is what unites art and politics. But politics and art shape the future in different ways. Politics understands the future as a result of actions that take place here and now. Political action has to be efficacious, to produce results, to transform social life. In other words, Political practice shapes the future, but it disappears in and through this future. It becomes totally absorbed by its own results and consequences. The goal of politics is to become obsolete, and to give way to the politics of the future. But artists do not work only within the public space of their time. They also work within the heterogeneous space of art archives, where their works are placed among the works of past and future. Art, as it functioned in modernity and still functions in our time, does not disappear after its work is done. Rather, the artwork remains present in the future. And it is precisely this anticipated future presence of art that guarantees its influence on the future, its chance to shape the future. Politics shapes the future by its own disappearance. Art shapes the future by its own prolonged presence. This creates a gap between art and politics, a gap that was demonstrated often throughout the tragic history of the relationship between left art and left politics in the 20th century. Our archives are of course structured historically, and our use of these archives is still defined by the 19th century's tradition of historicism. We thus tend to reinscribe artists posthumously into the historical contexts from which they actually wanted to escape. In this sense, the art collections that preceded the historicism of the 19th century, the collections that wanted to be collections of instances of pure beauty, for example, seem only at first glance to be naive. In fact, they are more faithful to the original utopian impulse than their more sophisticated historicist counterparts. It seems to me that today we are beginning to be more and more interested in the non-historicist approach to our past. We are becoming more interested in the decontextualization and reenactment of individual phenomena from the past than in their historical recontextualization, more interested in the utopian aspirations that lead artists out of their historical contexts than in these contexts themselves. And it seems to me that this is a good development because it strengthens the utopian potential of the archive and weakens its potential for betraying the utopian promise, the potential that is inherent in any archive, regardless of how it is structured. The Internet is presented by Groys. The archive is a manifestation of nonlinear time, without sequence. This video captures and filters my physical manifestation into ASCII characters, capturing, digitizing, translating, processing, analyzing, reforming, and broadcasting my image several times between my web camera and your screen. This filtering process provides shelter within the frame's gaze. These emissions make spaces, perhaps that's where creativity is. Questions and tests leaving this chapter. Interrogate these spaces in the video. Was this cutting back enough? What could be reintroduced, if anything? In a place that is post-authenticity and original, what value does the subject have? How can the subject validate itself? Is a live stream with a viewer a kind of validation or affirmation? What does the Internet's gaze look like? Feel like? What is the Internet's semiotic representation?